All right. When last we met, we talked about the stages of development that Ashton suggested, trying to pair up how the Gospel of John came to its current shape and form, and trying to pair that with what was going on in the community. All right, and so he suggests that perhaps it started as the missionary sign source. It was originally just kind of circulating as here are some signs that Jesus did. Then there was probably a separate passion source or a synoptic S source.
Is this the two-level drama working here? The passion source and then a separate one?
Not necessarily two-level drama. It's just these are kind of different components that then got combined into the basis for the gospel that we know today. As he suggests, this group seems to have originated within the synagogue. It was a Jewish group. And they had lots of conversations, right? Well, what do you think about Trump? I mean, Jesus, right? And as soon as the name comes up, everybody's got an opinion, right? And so you got, controversy going back and forth. And as these discussions happen, it kind of forces people into positions that they might not have realized that they believed, right? Well, if you're going to say that, then do you believe this? Oh, I guess I do. Hadn't thought about it, but yeah.
This was commonplace in all the temples as well, right? After that happened.
Well, you have these conversations going on, right? I mean, Jesus is a very controversial figure. Some people think he walks on water. Other people don't. And so, you get different opinions. And so Ashton suggests that this radical questioning of the believers drives them to develop their faith in new and unexpected ways, ultimately leading to the conclusion, no, you know what? I do think he's God. He's divine. Right? Once they make that step, though, okay, you're no longer part of us. Right? Because Judaism is a monotheistic faith. There is one God. Not one God and then another God that's down here walking around. Okay? So he suggests that eventually the group gets expelled based on the charge of ditheism, two gods. And he suggests that at this point they then put out their first edition of the gospel. Okay? And the purpose then is to kind of shore up the community, convince them, hey, you're not crazy for believing this. Now again, Brown suggests that they put out their gospel before, and that kind of precipitates their getting expelled. I don't know if there's really a good way to decide between those.
How long did God exist in the minds of the early Christians as a two-level God? Was it the Nicene Creed where they established the Trinity? And was there a period of time between them that they just thought of as like the ditheism or whatever?
Not clear. Not clear. Yeah.
So some of these questions could have been related. Like, for instance, there are denominations now that still have questions about the Trinity and don't adopt it. And so they split from churches over this Trinitarian doctrine. Right. And as we're going to see, when you split off from someone over a doctrinal issue or something like that, that issue then becomes a core aspect of who you understand yourself to be, right? Because this was significant enough that we can't even associate with you anymore because you believe that instead of what we believe. And so that's what the Johannine community is going to face, and we'll get to that in a minute. But you're absolutely right. Okay. When you're in kind of hostile territory, it serves to kind of bond you together, right? And so again, like chapter 14, it's the farewell discourse. It's all about faith. You got to have faith. You got to continue to hold strong what you believe in the face of all this opposition, right? Once you get kicked out, though, what happens? Well, now you suddenly don't have all that external pressure pushing you together. And so what starts to happen?
What was that?
Thoughts start to wonder,
Yeah, and then you start to realize, oh, well, maybe we don't agree so much, right? I mean, maybe we agree on that big issue, but you have this little nuance, and I don't think I agree with that little nuance, and now we have time to actually debate it because we don't have the big issue being discussed anymore, and so you get this internal tension developing. Okay? And so again, Lindar suggests that's more reflective of chapters 15 and 16 of the Farewell Discourse, where faith is not the key so much as love one another. Right? We got to hold together. We're all we've got. Right? And as I think it's more of a ghetto mentality. It's kind of, it's us against the world. We got to hold together because, who's going to look out for us if we don't? And so it's all about how you got to love one another. You got to stick together. Okay? So Ashton suggests that there's a second edition of the gospel that comes out at this point that reflects this internal tension that's developing and a slackening of the hostility toward the Jews. Right? When you're not always up in each other's face, then, you can kind of live and let live and, ask questions in a less threatening environment. And then finally you get the redactor who comes along and puts on the finishing touches and makes it into the gospel we know and love today. All right, does that make sense? Okay.
So now we don't know who the redactor is. I think knowing that person would just
Yeah.
make the difference, all the difference.
Yeah, it was Joe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
From Idaho.
Yes, exactly. No, I was being facetious. I do not know that his name was Joe. All right. So what happens after the expulsion? And this is where your Raymond Brown reading from last week comes in. He suggests that the heated controversy with the synagogue has two side effects. First off, it causes the community to emphasize certain aspects of their theology over others, and especially Jesus' divinity, right? Because that's the point at which they were, that's what ended up getting them expelled. Okay? Secondly, the community becomes especially sensitive to deviations from its Christology. In other words, as we were just saying, Christology becomes a defining characteristic of who we are. Right? So there may be other parts of theology that you can agree to disagree on, but when it comes to Christology, no. You have to believe he is divine. And if you don't, then you are not one of us. Does that make sense? Okay? Some community members, however, take this emphasis on Christ's divinity too far. In other words, it becomes the whole of their Christology rather than merely an emphasis. And this is where you're going to get the civil war that erupts within the Johannine community once they're on the outside. Okay?
They hide, right?
They what?
The Christians hide during all this? Or the ones fighting?
They're no longer welcome in the synagogue. Right, so they've been kicked out of their ancestral religion, of everything they've known, and so now they're on the outs.
They actually battle.
Yeah, they had get their armor on and do no, but you've read the epistles, right? And they're don't go stay with those people. They're the other side. And, like Democrats and Republicans today, right? Hopefully people don't take up guns and actually shoot each other, but there's in many ways a civil war going on in our country right now, right? Hopefully it doesn't get to real battles, but yeah, hopefully. All right. So Brown suggests the Johannine epistles reflect this stage of the community's development. Okay. So, they emerge from this post-expulsion, post-gospel struggle for the future of the community. And we see this in verses like 1 John 2:19. They went out from us, but they were not really of us. For if they had been of us, they would have remained with us. But they went out so that it would be shown that they all are not of us. Right? Yeah. In other words, they left. Therefore, they were never really of us in the first place, and we know that because they're gone. If they were really part of us, they would have stuck it out. Okay? He suggests the gospel portrays little sense of division within the community. The struggle in the gospel is mainly with outsiders in the world, right? So it's the world is the encroaching entity. In contrast, in the epistles, it's kind of internal issues, right? So look at 1 John 3:10. If you hit 2 John, you've gone too far. It says, the children of God and the children of the devil are revealed in this way. All who do not do what is right are not from God, nor are those who do not love their brothers and sisters. Right? You don't love your brother and sister, then you are not from God. Right? And no. If you leave, then by definition you are not loving your brother and sister.
But who is my brother?
Right? Or look at 4:5. They are from the world. Therefore what they say is from the world, and the world listens to them. Right? Which suggests what?
Outside of, they're speaking falsely what the world will believe.
Yes. So which group seems to be doing better?
Them.
Probably the other group, right? So how do we explain the fact that their numbers are growing and swelling while we're kind of dwindling and just barely? Well, they're just saying what the world wants to hear, right? Whereas we hold to the truth, right? Make sense? No. Yeah. Now you go talk to them, and they would have a slightly different take on it, I'm sure. But all right. Now there are problems, and we've alluded to this in past weeks. Both sides are appealing to the gospel, so it's not like you can simply dismiss their arguments as ill-founded. Right? Like you're debating with someone who's schooled in Greek philosophy. Okay, well, you've got this weird worldview that doesn't agree with my worldview, and that's why we can't. That's one thing. You can kind of dismiss those arguments, but this is different. Here, you're both appealing to the same scriptures. How do you discern in that case? Right? And then there's a second problem, because who is the ultimate teacher in the Johannine community? The Spirit. There's not, some pope or professor or, pastor that you can go to decide what's the correct interpretation. Because the Spirit comes to teach each of us. Yes?
Okay, all right, wait a minute. I'm trying to formulate this. All right, so the Johannine community Christology, based on who Christ was, that brings about the ditheism. But then they say that the ruling factor is the Spirit. Now that's the Trinity. You have the, so is it die or try?
Well,
if my thought process is going proper.
Yeah, I mean, that's why, to Garrett's question of, when do people start thinking of the Trinity, it's not really clear. I mean, you can find elements of Trinitarian thought throughout the New Testament.
Right.
I mean, there's a reason why we come up with the Trinity.
Right. I mean, it's not said in the Bible, the Trinity. That's a man-made concept or a wording to understand the concept.
Right.
But if they say that the Spirit is the teacher, doesn't that take away from the Christology and the divinity that they're holding so true to?
No, because remember what the Spirit does is He comes to remind them of all that Jesus said and did, and explain to them what he really meant and what its significance was. The Spirit comes to testify of him.
Yeah.
Right? And again, you can go back and look at the farewell discourse when he talks about, the Spirit's going to come and this is what the Spirit's going to do. He's going to lead you into all truth. I have a lot to say to you. You can't hear it right now, so I'm going to have to just hold off. But once I go away, then I can send the Spirit, and that's even better because I'm one person. I'm limited by particularity because I took on human flesh. But the Spirit can interact with all of you at the same time.
And that's where you will do greater things than I.
Mm-hmm.
Good. That's preaching good. Sunday was preaching wrong.
Yes.
Nobody know.
All right.
You got a guarantee on that?
All right, so what was the sectarians' Christology that was so offensive? Well, Brown points to something like John 20:31. But these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. We have a similar phrase in 1 John 2:22. Who is the liar but the one who denies that Jesus is the Christ? This is the Antichrist, the one who denies the Father and the Son. Okay? What Brown suggests, the gospel is stressing that Jesus is the Christ. Right? So when we say we did this so that you can believe that Jesus, that human guy we all know, he's actually the Christ. In 1 John 2:22, the emphasis is reversed. Here the point is that the Christ was actually this human guy, Jesus. His humanity matters. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So in conversations with Jews, they're having to emphasize Jesus' divinity. But in conversations with their fellow community members, they're having to emphasize, no, he was human too. Right? So same phrase, but a different emphasis in each context. Okay? Brown suggests that the sectarians hold that the human existence of Jesus, while real, so they don't go all the way to Docetism and Gnosticism and all those later developments, but it was not salvifically significant. Yeah, he was human because the Word became flesh, but it doesn't matter. All that really matters is his divinity. Okay? Now, how does Brown deduce that that was one of the sectarians' positions? How does he try to discern the sectarians' position? Well, and is there something they're arguing against that you could find a passage or so in the gospel that would actually seem to support that position? Okay? So, how could someone possibly come to the idea that his humanity is not salvifically significant? Well, have you read John? The gospel relativizes his humanity. It's not hard to see. I mean, in the Gospel of John, his humanity almost gets swallowed up in his divinity. Right?
In the beginning was the Word, not in the beginning was Jesus.
Right. And I mean, he's just exuding divinity on every page.
Right.
So it's not hard to see how someone could lose sight of his humanity. Right? Okay, yeah, it's there. He's a human, but it doesn't matter.
He's always God.
Right? Yeah. He's always got, and God always trumps the human part. So, all right. Now, certain elements of the gospel downplay the salvific role of Jesus' public ministry. And instead, they emphasize his sending and revelation. Right? Jesus is here to reveal. What's important is not what he does here, but the fact that he was sent. Right? The Word became flesh.
First John was written to a Greek community, right? And it was commonly understood as flesh is evil, and that community. So that
Well, it would have been a Jewish community. Right, because remember they originated in the synagogue and then got kicked out. But, I mean, they would have had Hellenistic, I mean, they're in the Hellenistic culture and milieu, so there's going to be some overlap.
Right. That
Right.
was a common idea that flesh is evil, spirit is good. And so the idea that besides that God became flesh, that this world is good, that this world matters, that the now matters.
Yeah, I mean, Judaism doesn't have this idea that all flesh is evil and bad. But that's Gnosticism. You got to get free of the flesh. Judaism isn't that. Judaism is more we have two natures within us, and you're going to listen to the good angel or the bad angel.
Listen to the bad angel, you gotta sacrifice a lamb.
Yeah. All right. And he would suggest you see the epistles refuting this kind of idea in passages like 1:7. 1 John 1:7. But if we walk in the light as he himself is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus his Son cleanses us from all sin. Right? It's his blood. What is it that makes him human? He's flesh and blood. Right? It's his blood that cleanses us from all sin.
That's the significance of the Passover, which makes Christ the Passover himself, right?
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, remember in John, he's the Paschal Lamb, the ultimate Paschal Lamb, the one whose blood saves us from death. And so these are verses that kind of emphasize his humanity and aspects of his humanity's role in his salvific effect. All right. Now, with regard to ethics, we get a passage like this in 1 John 1:5-10. As we read it, try to think, what does this seem to be pushing back against? Okay. This is the message we have heard from him and announced to you, that God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. If we say that we have fellowship with him and yet walk in the darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. But if we walk in the light as he himself is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus his Son cleanses us from all sin. If we say that we have no sin, we are deceiving ourselves, and the truth is not in us. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and righteous to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. If we say that we have not sinned, we make him a liar, and his word is not in us. Now, what does that seem to be pushing back against? What about sin? What kind of claims about sin?
That you don't do it.
Yeah. This is. This whole latter half of that passage is all about. Hey, if you say you don't sin, you're a liar, and you're making God out to be a liar too.
Isn't that
Cyclical logic. If you say you do this, but then you do it, then you aren't this, and you just keep rolling in on yourself. Is that? Maybe it's not cyclical logic that I'm thinking of, but it's you keep going back to being, you keep self-incriminating.
Yes. Yeah, it's self-incriminating. And so what Brown suggests is what the sectarians are probably saying is that they have been perfected. They don't sin anymore. Right? And that's why we've got this passage about, hey, if you say you don't sin, then guess what? You're a liar, and you're making God out to be a liar, and you're not. His word is not dwelling in you, right? Now, how in the world could people get the idea that they've been perfected and they don't sin anymore? Well, look at John 8:31-34. Remember, he looks for things that the epistles seem to be pushing back on that you can actually kind of justify based on the gospel. All right. Then Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him, "If you continue in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free." They answered him, "We're descendants of Abraham and have never been slaves to anyone. What do you mean by saying you will be made free?" Jesus answered them, "Very truly I tell you, everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not have a permanent place in the household, and the Son has a place there forever. So if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed."
So almost once saved, always saved.
Well, what's the logic here? If you sin, what are you? Well, you're a slave to sin, right? Anybody who sins is a slave to sin. But what does the Son do? Sets you free. Well, what would that seem to imply? If the Son sets you free,
Then you can't be free.
Then you can never sin again once the sin.
yeah, because if you sin, what are you? A slave. But the Son sets you free, so you're no longer a slave, which means you're not going to commit sin. I'm saying, so you can see how, and they could have biblical support for their position. And in fact, look at 1 John 3, 5 to 6. This is the same guy who just went on a rant about how, if you say you don't sin, then, his word is not in you and all this. Look what he says in chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. "You know that he was revealed to take away sins, and in him there is no sin. No one who abides in him sins. No one who sins has either seen him or knows him." If he holds that position, it doesn't seem like it's too far, hop, skip, and a jump to the idea that we're now sinless. In fact, it's worth thinking about how can you hold this position together with what he said in chapter 1. Right?
It doesn't work.
It requires some wrestling. It's not, an obvious thing.
But it would never match with Methodism because we said we're always seeking perfection. But not in this lifetime will we ever reach perfection. Because we are saved from sin, but we do sin.
Mm-hmm. But if you sin, you're a slave to sin, and you're obviously not abiding in him because no one who abides in him commits sin.
So the text is wrong.
So there's
Wait, what is it? Are you getting a sense of how nuanced this argument has to be?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, this is not. I mean, it's these little nuances such that he can lambast them as being completely cut off from God. Well, he seems to hold a position that seems awfully similar. Right?
Imagine these discussions at the dinner table.
Yes.
It would last long.
Yeah, and that's it. I'm leaving. So it doesn't seem too hard to believe that the sectarians, held to a perfectionism that their union with Christ made them sinless. Because it seems even like the Johannine community is pretty close to that, right?
Well, it's like when you think about what God does, or what Christ does to you, it washes out your sin. That is a reflection of just Jesus being on you. So without that, as a human, you would always remain in that sinful state. But it's almost like once you accept that washes it away and doesn't necessarily change anything. It's just the perspective in which God has on you now.
Okay. Yes, I mean, we're not going to wrestle this out to solve it here, but just to recognize, it's not hard to see how nuanced this discussion is, and how someone could take the side that seems to they've taken.
What I was trying to say is that it opens the door for your abuse of your gift.
Okay. Brown also suggests that they gave no salvific importance to ethical behavior, kind of like a lot of Protestant denominations today. Right? Well, how in the world that? Well, okay, that one seems a little more credible to us, perhaps. Well, again, look at John 6, 28, 29. They were Lutheran and didn't know it. John 6, 28. Then they said to him, "What must we do to perform the works of God. Jesus answered them, "This is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent." What do we have to do
Take comfort.
to please God? You just believe in the one he sent. Right?
That's all it is. You take comfort in what's already been done for you, despite what you are. You know?
Yeah, but you see how you could take that and say, okay, it doesn't matter what you do. Right? It kind of undermines that in the way that Lutheranism in its extreme forms today kind of undermines any ethics. Right? Because as soon as you start talking about what you do, oh no, now you're talking about works, and you know you can't talk about works because then you're talking about earning your salvation. Right? So they seem to have interpreted this to mean it doesn't matter what we do. We don't have to, be concerned about doing the right things or any of that. And the Johannine community says, no, you're wrong. Whatever that passage means, that's not it.
It's interesting that they had that discussion because you really want to know how you live in this new revelation that we're in.
Yeah.
Like how do I behave now that I don't have to worry about this kind of thing?
Yeah, and now we have to ask the question: how do you know who's right? Because you're each appealing to the same text.
You don't.
Maybe different parts, but I got my verse from John and you got your verse from John. We do the same thing today, right? Well, I throw my favorite verse at you and you throw your favorite verse at me, and it's Matthew 11 all over again. We just, talk right past each other.
It's the dirge, it's the singing, it's the...
Exactly. We got to stop doing that. So how do we determine what's actually right? When you're in the midst of it. Right? We have the advantage of hindsight. Now we can look and say, well, yeah, the Johannine community was right on this issue. Because
should we simplify it then? Just continually simplify the concepts? Because it does seem like we're always making it harder than it needs to be.
maybe, but you've got to have theological nuance.
I agree with that.
Right?
You gotta know the root of it all.
Yeah. And so how do you say, and again, so you can't appeal to Scripture because they're doing the same thing. And you can't appeal to the Spirit because they can do the same thing. So how do you even go about finding a ground on which you can agree together on this is going to be how we decide these issues?
I don't know if you can. I think you just have to accept the fact that it is. Like, this is where we are in our theology. You have your opinion of mine, we can't prove
Then
it.
there's no hope that we'll ever be able to come together.
Until we find something amazingly better, or if Christ comes back himself and tells us what to think.
Yes.
The nuances of supplying is that these are still unsettled questions even today in many.
Well,
They come up to a decision as to how they're going to live. Certainly the people who were into perfectionism had ethical behavior as a standard. And I don't know how much
well, possibly. Remember, they can't sin because they're in Christ.
Yes.
And so what they do doesn't matter.
So it's almost like a predestined issue. Once you're in Christ, then you're predestined that you can never sin.
Well, as long as you remain in Him.
Yeah.
As long as you remain in Him.
But what does it mean to stay in Him?
Right. And again, our purpose today is not to try to hash this out and figure out whether, but just to realize, how do we go about having theological discussions?
The other person would agree.
Yes. No. you bring the bigger guys.
It's a very large Bible.
Yeah. Yes.
And it's all done on social media, and we're all going to change each other.
Yeah, social media is a great medium for that.
I know it works for you.
Yes. The other thing about the ethics is that they failed to love their brothers and sisters. How do we know that they didn't love their brothers and sisters? Well, by definition, they left. They left. And now here's something to note too. Which group left the synagogue? And who was right? The Johannine community had to leave the synagogue, right? But they were the ones in the right. Right? Theologically, we hold they had it right, the synagogue was wrong, Jesus actually is God.
Yeah. Or
Right?
the Christian and Jew would say.
Right.
You know,
Who left in this case? The sectarians, right? They're the ones who went out. They went out from us. They left us to go hold their mega church services and all that.
They went to the temple.
Yeah.
They all were in a temple and they left that temple and left the Christians in that temple.
Not necessarily in a temple.
But
They're not associating with us anymore,
okay.
right? And he's like, don't go to this person's house because they're on that side. And if this person comes to you, don't give them anything, right?
They were Presbyterian, now they're Associate Reformed Presbyterian.
Right.
They're crossing the
Right.
sidewalk when they see
So just because one group leaves, you can't always determine who's right simply by which group is the splinter group, right? Because in one case, the Johannine got kicked out,
And they were
the splinter group, and they were the ones that according to Scripture, were in the right. But here, it's the sectarians who split off and are no longer with us.
It harkens back to the Maccabees who splintered off and said, we're going to stand for this, but then started making everybody change to what they had already splintered off to.
Right. Right.
I was listening earlier.
Yeah, the Maccabees who revolted because they were having religious practices forced upon them. So this is not fair. But then once they were in power, they then go conquer the Idumeans and say, all right, you better circumcise and convert to Judaism or else. They start doing the very thing which again is the standard pattern. You become like what you focus on. You become like what you focus on. And if you continue to look at those who hate you, you're going to end up exactly like them.
I started cynical when you started.
And each side has to, you say, how do you talk about this? Each side has to have delegates who are there to say, we're here to converse, not I'm here to convert.
Mm-hmm.
Because you'll never get it when you converse at a table and talk to each other and listen. Okay, you say it's black, I say it's gray, you say it's white, I say it's green. We have to say, where are you coming from, the experiences, and such. And then
Yeah.
we work together.
Because again, we all filter things through our own experience and lenses of culture and theology and all of this. And so you're going to see things differently than I do. And that's why we need to come together, because you can help me see things that my filters are taking out, and I can help you see things that your filters are taking out. Right?
That's all we can do is compare what we observe.
Well, and these are conversations, too, that we need to have, even though they're often uncomfortable and they're not fun. And it's easier to just kind of pretend we don't disagree or don't talk about those issues because we know those issues, stir up strong feelings. But if I really love you and you really love me and you think I am headed the wrong way on a certain thing, you owe it to me to try to convince me that you're right and I'm not. Right? If my son is doing something that I see is going to, get him into trouble, I owe it to him to try to open his eyes to that, even if he doesn't appreciate it. Because he's convinced that's a good thing to do. It's not very loving of me to say, well, I don't want to get engaged in a tough conversation with you, so I'll let you go ahead and do it. Now, having said that, there are times where people are not going to listen to you, and you got to just let them go and reap the consequences of what they're doing, and then maybe they'll let the chaos find them to remove the filters so that they might be able to hear or see the light clearly.
But you were also not there at the end of the tunnel going, ha ha, I told you so.
Right. Right.
You're there to say, how can I help you repair?
Right. Right. And remember the kingdom scribes in Matthew. That are there to kind of say, hey, yeah, remember that thing Jesus said? This is actually what it meant. Right? So, how does 1 John counter the claim of Spirit-inspired teaching? Because these sectarians are presuming to say, well, the Spirit has told me this is what this text means. All right? Couple ways. One, he only mentions the Spirit in 2 sections. Right? So he's not going to appeal to the Spirit is saying this, because that's not helpful in this kind of conversation. Because everybody can say that. All right? Look at the 2 places where he does mention it. So 3:24 down to 4:6. All who obey his commandments abide in him, and he abides in them. And by this we know that he abides in us by the Spirit that he has given us. Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God. For many false prophets have gone out into the world. By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. And every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard that it is coming, and now it is already in the world. Okay? So what is he saying about the Spirit?
It sounded like it was like multiple spirits that you can test. It seems like ghosts that come and bring information.
Yeah, his point here is you've got to discern. Just because you hear something and are able to pull it out of the ether or out of the spiritual realm doesn't mean God's the one speaking it. Right? It may be a demonic spirit that's speaking it. It may be the spirit of Antichrist. It may be your own soul that's kind of whispering to you. So you have to discern. Right? And then how does he say you discern here?
We know him because he abides in us.
He abides in us, but how do you test the spirits? Yeah. Any spirit that says Jesus came in the flesh is going to be from God. Anyone that denies Jesus came in the flesh is not going to be from God. Right? And here we see the first kind of inkling with the word. Spirit and flesh have to testify together. Right? Which we saw in John 2. Remember when we looked at destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up. Well, how do you know he's really talking about his body? Well, the Spirit told me so. Well, the Spirit told me it was the ice cream cart that took him 3 days to repair. How do we know who's right? Well, because it actually makes much better sense of the text if he's talking about his body, because then he's answering the question that they asked, namely, by what authority do you do this? I do this by the authority of the God who's dwelling inside me. And that's why I can call my body a temple. Right? So spirit and flesh, spirit and text have to testify together. If what you're hearing from the spirit realm is denying the importance of the flesh, that's not coming from God. Now, here's the next question. Why is that the particular test?
Denies the sacrifice.
Well, what is the issue that's embroiling the community?
The divinity of God coming in the flesh.
Well, does his flesh matter?
Yeah.
Right? Does his flesh matter? That's why this is the particular test at that time. Now, today, I've still seen, someone will be leading worship and all of a sudden they start prophesying. Someone will go up and say, did Jesus Christ come in the flesh? Yes. Okay, it's good. Right? That may not be the critical issue today. In other words, there may be spirits who are able to say that, but on the critical issue of today, they're not going to be right. Does that make sense?
No.
I know.
So So any spirit that denies Jesus came in the flesh clearly is not from God, right? But the reason that is the test they listen is because of the particular issue that was roiling the community.
That makes sense.
Namely, does his flesh matter?
Yeah.
Right? That was the critical issue of the day. Each generation has their own critical issue that's going to determine whether people are hearing from God or listening to something else. Right? In Paul's day, it was, what is the role of the law? Right? In John's day, it was, is Jesus divine? In the Johannine community's day, it was, does his flesh matter? Right? That's the question you need to be discerning on. Does that make sense?
So what do you think is ours for this day?
I think there are several. I think, again, we are reaching the point where this country is called to start walking out its calling. And it is called to be a model of what it means to from out of many, e pluribus unum, from out of many one. And that is why you are seeing so many efforts to divide us.
We're supposed to be the example of the kingdom.
Yes. Yes, that is part of the calling of this country. And there are discussions that need to be had about how that actually works. How do we come together? How do we combine the wisdom and revelation, the knowledge and life? And what you're seeing right now is people on either side, champions of life. Well, if you don't, support my position, then you just want to kill children and all this. And champions of knowledge, completely dismiss arguments from the other side. And we've got to see how to come together. Now, part of that means dealing with our past and our history. And we have a lot of issues that have been band-aided over and not dealt with. But before we can deal with it, you've got to get it out into the open. And so that's why God is allowing a lot of this stuff to come out, because we've got to deal with it.
Anything that leads us to unity and love, compassion would be from God, and anything that would be the opposite would be from that spirit.
Yeah, that's the kind of idea,
Okay.
right?
All right.
So yeah, anything that, even if it sounds like it's promoting unity, but it's actually serving to divide people, is not in line with what God is doing at this time. Yes.
Well, no, never mind.
We're
I
done.
mean, there's just so much political stuff
Yeah.
Yep.
that fits into this.
Yes.
That if we're looking at, we're also reading this book in systematic theology too, that really challenges, our nation's destiny. But, when you look at e pluribus unum, out of one comes many, or
Out of many, one. Right.
I'm sorry. And so we're arguing over an ancient concept of how people become community.
Mm-hmm.
And here we are back in this community where does his flesh matter? Is he God? And was the fact that he was human significant to what we believe?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the double-edged sword of having as much freedom as we have. We can get lost in the tangents or the rabbit holes and have what they consider first world issues of gun control or pro-choice or pro-life. We have those issues, whereas a third world country, they're struggling just to not drink tainted water out of a trash bottle. And if we're to be the...
Although, if there's a new book that came out this summer, or last spring, called Factfulness. Factfulness. That actually, so if you look at the evidence, we tend to think, the world has, kind of the first world and the third world. It's not that way anymore. It's not that way. The percentage that is still down here is very small. And most of the world is now up here now.
There's tons of Facebook videos of people who look like third world countries, but they got Wi-Fi signals. They got something going on.
Yeah.
But there again, we're elevating we've got these issues when we still have within our community, even within a mile of hood, there are children who have no food. And how does that happen in the greatest country ever, that we have people who are hungry? And so it's not a first and third all the time. We have third world issues a mile from us.
Yes, and part of the issue is coming together. How do we take these seemingly competing values and bring them together in a way that's actually going to work?
That's what our ministry is about.
Right? I mean, so like the illegal migrants coming into the United States, right? One side says, there's humanitarian crisis, we've got to care for people. The other side says, we can't care for the whole world. Right? We don't have the resources to care for the whole world. And so the question then is, how do you marry these things? We still have people in our own communities that need food and shelter so how do we combine? How do we bring those competing values together in a way that moves us forward helpfully?
You can't police the world. You can't save the world.
Right, and I think it starts by recognizing that the other side, whichever side of that debate you fall on, has legitimate values that is driving their concerns. Right? And so then try to find a way forward that acknowledges and works with both of those values and incorporates both of them, bringing wisdom and life together.
But is it not typically these issues are never quite resolved? Instead, there's a schism. They separate.
Yeah, that's often what happens.
We handle it most of the time.
Right.
Half the village went that way.
Right. And just as in Matthew 11, as long as you stay separate, you're both heading for judgment. And you end up with civil wars because that's how you've got to resolve the issue. Because if we don't come together, then he's going to have to allow situations and circumstances to arise that force us to come together. And remember, when you're free out here, you can pick and divide with each other. So how do you get people to come together? Well, you got to get something oppressing and pushing them together. That's not the pleasant way to do it. Right? Okay. So, he says, it's great to hear from the Spirit, but you got to test it. You've got to test it. And again, I would suggest the principle here is spirit and flesh, or spirit and text, have to testify together. Okay? We also get this in 5, 6 to 8. This is the one who came by water and blood, Jesus Christ. Not with the water only, but with the water and the blood. And the Spirit is the one that testifies, for the Spirit is the truth. There are 3 that testify, the Spirit and the water and the blood, and these 3 agree. Okay? So the testimony of the Spirit is tied to the testimony of His blood and water. And those are often taken to refer to His death and His baptism. And so again, you have the Spirit testifying in accordance with His flesh. Right? They are testifying together. These 3 testify together, and that's how you can discern that that's true. Because you've got 3 witnesses. The water, the blood, and the Spirit. And so again, like on the issues of the day, I think homosexuality is another big one. You're not going to be allowed to sit on the fence any longer. You're going to have to decide, should the church embrace this or not? And again, I would encourage you, if you can't, if what you're hearing from the Spirit seems different than what you're reading in the text, you haven't understood. Now, maybe you're hearing the Spirit correctly and you need to find a better way of reading the text. Or maybe you're reading the text correctly and you need to start listening to a different spirit. But until you can see how those things come together, you haven't heard fully or completely. You have not understood. If you want to set people free, find a better way to read the text. Does that make sense? Again, because, like women in ministry. You go to a church that does away with, oh, it's okay, God told me I can preach. Well, how well does that go over? It doesn't, right? Well, sweetie, whatever you think God told you, I have the word right here that says, right? Don't surrender the text. And don't just take your favorite proof text that seems to support your position and say, well, but there's this other passage. Take their passage. Find a better way to read their passage. Actually, no. The way you're reading that, there's a better way of understanding that. Right? Because if you can do that, that's when you'll start setting people free.
You can't cherry pick verse 5 and 6. You have to look at 1 through 5 and 6 through 12 of the context.
Yeah.
You can make anything true from, you can cherry pick everything out of the Bible, but it's the content, when it was written, who it was written for. That's why we have the four Gospels written in different groups to be able to come together.
Mm-hmm.
If we just had Mark as the only Gospel, we'd be losing a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so you've got to, again, keep wrestling with it. And again, don't take the passages that seem to support your view. Take the ones that seem to support the other view. Because those are the ones that are the problem for it. And if God is giving you that revelation, then ask Him to give you a better reading of those texts so that you can see how they testify together. Does that make sense? Okay. The second thing he does, there are no I say this. Right? So you read Paul. He's like, well, Paul, I think I'm pretty trustworthy. This is my opinion. Right? You don't get that here. Why? Because again, the Spirit teaches everybody. It doesn't matter what I say if the Spirit's telling you something different. So what I have to do is help you be a better discerner of the Spirit that you're listening to. Does that make sense? And again, number 2 is not decisive, being inspired by the Spirit. And so you have to call for testing. Even while acknowledging that the world, and apparently others in the Johannine community, listen to the sectarians. Right? So you've got to be careful what you're using as your means of discerning. It's not whoever has the most people coming to their church on Sunday. Right? It's not who has the people going, wow, I'm really moved by what he said today. She was really moving in the Spirit. But what Spirit? Right? Yeah. So you've got to be discerning. Don't surrender the word. Don't surrender your revelation. Keep wrestling with them until you can see how to bring them together. Does that make sense? And again, this is why we need one another to have these difficult conversations, right? To see how we can bring our values together in ways that promote all of them. There's a Center for Bipartisanship, and in the politics class that we did last summer, I had them read the their book, City of Rivals. But it talks about how our political system is constructed to force this conversation between those on different sides. And they have set their center up. The purpose, they try to get as partisan Democrat and Republicans as they can. And the rule is, when you come into a policy discussion, you don't check your politics at the door. You bring them with you. Because I need you to be the strongest Democrat you can be, and I need me to be the strongest Republican I can be, or however it shakes out. Because if you championing your ideals and me championing my ideals can come together and agree on a way forward, then we have a chance of actually getting something that people can rally around.
How will that really happen in actual politics?
Well, they do, and you can go on and look at. I mean, they take policy issues and they pull together partisan experts, and they say, all right, have at it.
They package deal it with something cruddy.
It's like if the two senators that stopped the judicial hearings, Blake from Arizona and Doyle, anyway, he's from Delaware. They reasoned, and because they were respectful of each other and had a relationship, then we saw bipartisanship happen. We hadn't seen it in so long because two sides have been yelling at each other and no one was listening.
Yeah, and here's the thing. People often look to the moderates to try to make compromise. Compromises made by moderates never fly.
Yeah.
Because they might get together and agree, but the extremes never will. That's why they say, when you come in, I need you to be as partisan as you can. Because if you being as partisan as you can ultimately and we can get to something that we can all sign off on, then it's got a shot of actually, making it through.
How do you get rid of the extremes?
That's the point. You don't get rid of them.
The extremists is what he said. The extreme edges, if they can come together, everybody in between them will move forward.
Right. The point is not to make everybody the same in the middle. The point, and that's, Paul in his epistles is so upset because they're forcing the Gentiles to become Jews. He's like, no, we need them to be Gentiles. Because what they bring as Gentiles is important to the body. Right? Just like we don't need African American churches to become just like white churches. Because what African American churches bring to the body is something we as white churches need. And white churches have something that African American churches need. So the point is not to let's all become the same. The point is,
We're not all high.
Exactly. And we need to learn how to come together so that we can all benefit one another. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think we take our business principles and try to apply it to this, and it doesn't work. And oftentimes, if you want your company to be successful, you do cut off the extremes. You go with that one thing because that's what works. But this isn't that. This is life. But you do that naturally for some reason. I don't know why. How do you get people to stop doing that?
Well, it's in many ways easier if you can just get people who don't care so much and get them in the middle to kind of, and then you get a majority. And
you see it in sports teams all the time. They get rid of their one player that's causing problems, and all of a sudden the team is better again. Well, that's not life. That's just that team.
Yeah, that's a slightly different issue, I think. You can have troublemakers that they're not there to be productive. But that's different than someone who is honestly willing and wanting to engage in conversation about how can we come together and move forward, right? I mean, in political discussions, as we said, there are some people that are just there to create chaos and get people riled up, and they're not helpful to have around, right? But you want people who are firmly committed and passionately committed to the values that they stand for. And you want to bring together people who are equally passionately committed to opposing values. Because if they can come together and agree on a way forward, then you're in a position to see how to bring the two sides together and come up with something that could actually work. Does that make sense? All right. Any other questions about the Johannine epistles? You see how they're kind of a subsequent episode to the gospel, and they're dealing with fallout of people having different interpretations of the gospel, and how do you discern, which again are the same issues we're facing today. Not so much that is Jesus divine or human. That kind of got set. Each generation hopefully settles their issue moving forward. Sometimes they get reopened, but Yep.
I was reading through all this stuff. It was kind of confusing to me because I thought I came to the viewpoint that they were talking about his humanity and his divinity, and which one was purposeful for salvic purposes and all that sort of stuff. And that's the reason why they had this big split. Am I in the right vein?
Yeah, that's exactly what they were arguing over.
Okay, I just want to make sure that I was in the right vein when I was reading through this stuff because it was beginning to get a little confusing.
Yeah. So what he's saying is the community in the synagogue, because the Jews around them were saying, this guy can't be God.
Right.
And so that kind of became a calling card of the Johannine community. No, we believe that Jesus is divine. So they get kicked out. But then once they're kicked out, then they start exploring the nuances of, well, what does this really mean and how does it work out? And some of them decide, you know what, his divinity is all that matters. And others said, no, his divinity is important, but you can't lose his humanity too. And that seeming nuance was enough to ultimately split the community. And that's what they're then wrestling with.
Right, in retrospect, we know because of the fact that we weren't back then. So.
Right, and so again, there's an advantage to those who have not seen. There's an advantage to not being in the situation. Because when you're in the situation, it's really hard to discern who's right. We, standing 2,000 years later, with the advantage of hindsight and retrospect, we can see which side God vindicated. Right? Those who said, yes, he is divine, but his humanity is also important.
Because how can we as human beings, created human beings, understand or have Jesus understand us if he's just fully divine? He's not one of us per se, but having his humanity important to us brings us that, yes, he went through what I'm going through, and that gives me a sense of sort of looking for.
He can understand.
Yes, yeah.
He can.
His humanity, it doesn't complete the covenant. The covenant requires human to do it, right? Praise God.
Well, let's leave that question aside because that'll get us astray. But yeah, it's like we were talking about when we were comparing Mark and Luke, right? And there's something comforting about knowing that Jesus felt overwhelmed to the point of death and felt like God had abandoned him at times, and all he could see was darkness. But there's also comfort in seeing a Jesus, the Lucan Jesus, who's completely in control, not bothered by anything. He's got this, right? Let's do this, right? And it's even more so in John, right? Pray that you'd save me from this hour. Forget that. This is the whole reason I came. Right? So, yes, there is value in being able to hold both of those things together.